The crystal chandeliers of the Rosewood Country Club cast a flawless golden glow over Washington's elite painting, a picture of perfect marriages and untouchable power. But beneath the clinking champagne flutes in tailored tuxedos, a single hushed phone call echoing in a dim marble hallway is all it takes to shatter a decade of vows. The man she built an empire for is whispering promises to someone else, unraveling a betrayal darker than a simple affair. If stories of shattered trust, hidden sins, and the cold, elegant revenge of a broken woman resonate with you, stay with me. There are far more secrets hiding behind these closed doors, and you won't want to miss how this one unfolds. The air inside the Rosewood Country Club was thick with the scent of expensive Tom Ford cologne and the low, calculated hum of Washington, D.C. networking. Abigail Reed stood near the edge of the grand ballroom, a flute of untouched Laurent Perrier resting in her manicured hand. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, the 10-year anniversary of Urban Nails, the franchise she had built from a cramped, chemical-smelling studio in Georgetown into a multi-million-dollar national empire. Yet it was her husband, Mark Stevens, who was currently holding court at the center of the room. He looked every bit the polished CEO, his custom tuxedo fitting perfectly over his broad shoulders as he charmed a circle of potential investors and local politicians. Abigail watched him, a familiar quiet exhaustion settling deep in her bones. She was the architect, he was the face. It was a pragmatic arrangement she had accepted for the sake of their marriage and the brand's image in this city of optics. But lately the invisible lines of their partnership had begun to suffocate her. Needing a brief reprieve from the overwhelming warmth of the ballroom and the endless empty smiles of diplomats' wives, Abigail slipped through a set of heavy mahogany doors. She stepped into the dimly lit silk-lined corridor that led to the club's private lounges. The lively jazz music instantly muffled behind her, replaced by the hushed, heavy stillness of the hallway. She paused by a large gilded mirror to adjust the strap of her evening gown when a voice drifted from the shadowed alcove just ahead. Mark's voice. "I told you you have to be patient, Emily. Tonight is about the optics." Abigail froze. Her breath caught somewhere in her throat, the sudden silence in her own mind entirely deafening. Emily Johnson. The bright, aggressively ambitious marketing director they had hired just 6 months ago. Abigail pressed her back against the cool wall, her heart hammering a slow, painful rhythm against her ribs. She didn't move closer, terrified that the rustle of her dress would give her away. "It's not just about the shares." Mark's voice continued, dropping to a low, intimate murmur that Abigail hadn't heard directed at her in years. "I'll handle Abigail. She trusts me implicitly. Once the corporate restructuring is finalized next week, she'll be phased out of the daily operations anyway. Then it's just us, I promise." The words hung in the air, toxic and heavy. "I'll handle Abigail." A cold numbness spread through her limbs, starting from her fingertips and wrapping tightly around her chest like a vice. She didn't gasp. She didn't storm the alcove or throw her champagne in his face demanding answers. Abigail was a creature of Washington. She knew intrinsically that the one who lost their temper was the one who lost the war. Through the slight gap in the alcove's shadow, she caught a glimpse of him. He was leaning against a marble pillar, staring down at his phone with a soft, affectionate smile. A smile she hadn't seen since their honeymoon a decade ago. He wasn't just sleeping with a junior employee. He was actively dismantling her life, stealing her empire piece by piece right under her nose. She looked down at her left hand. The 3-carat diamond caught the dim amber light of the corridor. It suddenly looked less like a symbol of unwavering devotion and more like a heavy, glittering shackle. 10 years of building a life, pouring her soul into a company reduced to a whispered, treacherous promise in a dark hallway. Abigail didn't wait for him to finish the call. She turned silently, retreating back toward the lobby. As she walked out into the cool, biting D.C. night air, leaving her husband to his lies and his applause, Abigail felt a profound, terrifying shift within her. The loving, supportive wife had just died in that corridor, and whatever was left standing in her place was entirely cold, entirely awake, and trusted absolutely no one. The Monday morning air in downtown Washington, D.C. was crisp, carrying the metallic scent of exhaust in the relentless rhythm of a city that never stopped moving. Abigail Reed walked through the revolving glass doors of the Urban Nails headquarters, her posture immaculate, a tailored wool coat shielding her from the autumn chill. She had spent the entire weekend suffocating in the silence of their Georgetown townhouse, watching Mark sleep, mapping out a quiet, methodical plan to secure her financial standing before confronting him about Emily. She just needed into her office. She needed the server logs, the private equity emails, the raw data of the empire she had built from scratch. She approached the security turnstiles and tapped her keycard against the scanner. Instead of the familiar green chime, a flat, dissonant red light blinked back at her. Access denied. Abigail frowned, tapping it again. Red. Mrs. Stevens. Abigail turned to see David, the head of building security, approaching with a tight, uncomfortable expression. He didn't look her in the eye. I'm sorry, ma'am. Your credentials have been deactivated. Mr. Stevens left instructions for you to meet him in conference room B on the ground floor. A low warning hum vibrated in Abigail's ears, drowning out the ambient noise of the lobby. She didn't ask questions. She merely nodded, her face a mask of polite indifference, and walked toward the frosted glass doors of the conference room. Mark was already there. He was standing by the mahogany table, casually scrolling through his phone, perhaps texting Emily, she thought, with a sickening jolt, flanked by the company's lead corporate attorney and the head of HR. The sheer calculated speed of his maneuver was breathtaking. Abigail, Mark said, pocketing his phone. His voice was laced with that same smooth, practiced warmth he used on television networks. He gestured to the empty leather chair opposite him. Please sit. Why is my badge deactivated, Mark? She asked, her voice quiet, refusing to take the seat. Mark sighed, a perfect performance of heavy-hearted leadership. The board held an emergency session at 7 this morning. As we finalized the restructuring phase we discussed at the gala, it was unanimously decided that the company needs a singular, streamlined executive vision. Your role as founder, it's become largely ceremonial, Abigail. We feel it's best for you to step down, effective immediately. The words hit her physical body like a quiet execution. Unanimously decided, he had lobbied the board behind her back. He had weaponized the corporate bylaws of the very entity she had breathed life into, racing to her to solidify his own power and clear the deck for his new life with his marketing director. You are terminating me from my own company. Abigail stated the syllables, tasting like ash. We are offering a very generous severance and a silent buyout of your remaining voting shares. The attorney interjected, softly sliding a thick manila folder across the table. It's a clean break, Mrs. Stevens, for everyone's benefit. Abigail looked at Mark. He met her gaze with a chillingly blank stare. There was no remorse, no hesitation. The man she had loved for 10 years was entirely gone, replaced by a stranger wearing his face, protecting his assets and guarding his secrets. She did not touch the folder. She did not yell, nor did she grant him the satisfaction of seeing her break. She simply turned her back to the three of them and walked out the door. Moments later, Abigail stood alone on the cold DC pavement. The morning commuters rushed past her, a blur of gray suits and steaming coffee cups. She looked up at the towering glass building that housed a decade of her sweat, her late nights, her entire identity. It was gone. Her marriage was a lie, her life's work stolen, and the people she had hired and trusted had signed off on her execution. A freezing, absolute paranoia settled deep into her chest. She had nothing left, and in this city of vipers, she knew she could never trust another living soul again. The basement bar of the Hayadams was steeped in shadows, political whispers, and the bitter scent of aged bourbon. Abigail sat in a curved crimson booth, tracing the rim of her lowball glass. 3 days had passed since her brutal exile from Urban Nails. 3 days of unanswered emails from former colleagues blocked access and moving her personal belongings into a temporary luxury suite in DuPont Circle. Mark had already changed the locks on their Georgetown townhouse, citing a sudden need for security protocols. She was a ghost in the city she had helped conquer. They say Mark Stevens is a visionary. A low, distinctly unbothered voice broke her concentration. But looking at the quarterly projections he just leaked to my firm, I'd say he's a man driving a very expensive car with his eyes closed. Abigail didn't flinch. She slowly lifted her gaze to find Vikram Patel sliding into the leather seat opposite her. Vikram was an apex predator in the private equity ecosystem, a man who bought distressed legacies, stripped them of their sentimentality, and sold them for staggering profits. He wore a charcoal bespoke suit that whispered of foreign tailoring, his dark eyes analyzing her with the detached precision of a surgeon. "Mr. Patel," Abigail said, her voice completely devoid of warmth. "I don't recall scheduling a pitch meeting." "You didn't. You've been fired. Your husband is publicly parading a 30-year-old marketing director as his new strategic partner, and your board is quietly panicking," Vikram replied smoothly. He signaled the bartender for a scotch with a subtle flick of his wrist. "I don't do pitches, Abigail. I do interventions." Abigail tightened her grip on her glass. The rawness of Mark and Emily's affair being an open secret in the financial sector stung, but she forced the humiliation down into the cold, hardened vault her heart had become. "If you want to buy Urban Nails, you're talking to the wrong spouse. I have no voting power." Mark saw to that. "Mark saw to the obvious mechanisms," Vikram corrected, leaning forward, the amber light catching the sharp angles of his face. "But he's arrogant. He didn't build the foundation, you did. He's currently trying to secure a massive line of credit to rebrand the entire West Coast division. He's over-leveraged, Abigail. Vulnerable." The scotch arrived. Vikram didn't touch it. He kept his eyes locked on hers. "I have $3 billion in liquid capital looking for a hostile home," he continued softly, the words slicing through the low jazz playing in the background. "I want Urban Nails, but I don't want to run a beauty empire. I want the margins, the real estate, and the satisfaction of watching Mark Stevens implode. You want your throne back, and you want blood." Abigail studied him. Every instinct screamed at her to walk away. This man was a shark. Stepping into the water with him was corporate suicide. Yet as she looked at Vikram's steady hands resting on the mahogany table, she realized they shared a vital trait. Neither of them was burdened by the illusion of loyalty. This wasn't a friendship. It was a weapon. "A hostile takeover requires a trigger," Abigail said, her tone shifting, the executive returning to the surface. "Mark holds 51% of the proxy votes due to the restructuring. Unless we find a breach of fiduciary duty," Vikram noted, his lips curving into a terrifyingly calm smile. "A breach significant enough to invalidate the proxy transfers. And who better to know where the bodies are buried than the woman who laid the concrete?" Silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of impending ruin. Abigail thought of the gilded hallways of the Rosewood, the condescending pity in the HR director's eyes, and Mark's cold, blank stare in the conference room. "I want 55% equity when the dust settles and absolute operational control," Abigail stated, her voice dropping to a rigid whisper. "And I want him to leave with absolutely nothing." Vikram finally picked up his glass, raising it an inch in her direction. "It's a deal, partner." Abigail did not clank her glass against his. She merely took a slow sip of her drink, the burning sensation mirroring the coal fire finally igniting within her. The war had officially begun. The relentless drumming of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Vikram Patel's penthouse offered the only soundtrack to the room's suffocating silence. It was nearly 3 in the morning. The glow of multiple high-resolution monitors cast long, harsh shadows across the minimalist glass desk, illuminating the exhaustion etched around Abigail's eyes. A half-empty cup of espresso had gone cold beside her hand. Vikram sat opposite her, his tie discarded hours ago, his focus entirely consumed by the cascading lines of encrypted data. Through a combination of Abigail's residual administrative access and the quiet, legally ambiguous expertise of Vikram's private forensic team, they had bypassed Mark's superficial firewalls. "Here," Vikram said, his voice a low, gravelly intrusion into the quiet. He tapped a manicured finger against a screen. "Delaware LLC registered 3 years ago under a proxy. He's been siphoning marketing capital from the East Coast division to fund a separate, unauthorized venture. This is the breach of fiduciary duty we need. The proxy votes are effectively void if we present this to the SEC." Abigail stared at the numbers. It was the kill shot they had been hunting for. The definitive proof that would rip the CEO title from Mark's hands and return Urban Nails to her. Yet the victory felt hollow, metallic, and entirely devoid of warmth. She nodded slowly, her eyes drifting back to her own monitor, where she was manually sorting through the raw, unindexed data dump of Mark's personal server. "You have him, Abigail?" Vikram observed quietly, sensing her detachment. He leaned back, watching her with that same unsettling, clinical gaze. "You should be smiling." "I don't smile at crime scenes, Vikram," she murmured, her hand resting on the mouse. Her cursor hovered over a deeply buried directory. It was labeled with a simple, innocuous string of numbers, 0418-archive. Something about the date format caught her breath. April 2018. That was 6 years ago. Emily Johnson was still in college in 2018. Ignoring the knot tightening in her stomach, Abigail clicked the folder. It didn't contain financial spreadsheets or vendor contracts. It was a massive repository of exported email threads, audio files, and saved photographs meticulously hidden behind a dual encryption layer that Vikram's software had just cracked open. She opened the first text file. The metadata showed an exchange sent at 2 in the morning while Abigail would have been asleep in their bed just feet away. Mark, the anniversary dinner was agonizing. I spent the entire evening looking across the table wishing she was you. A is entirely clueless. Abigail's blood ran cold. The sheer cruelty of the words, the casual dismissal of her existence paralyzed her. A is entirely clueless. He had used her initial like a medical abbreviation. She scrolled down, her hand beginning to tremble. The dates spanned years, 2018, 2019, 2021. The betrayal was not a sudden lapse in judgment or a midlife crisis triggered by an ambitious junior executive. It was an ecosystem. Mark had been living a parallel parasitic life in the shadows of her success for the better part of their marriage. Vikram noticed the shift in her posture, the rigidness of her spine, the way her breathing had completely stopped. He stood up and walked around the desk, pausing just behind her chair. He looked at the screen. For the first time since they met, the cynical amusement vanished from his face, replaced by a heavy, grim understanding. Abigail didn't look at him. She couldn't. Her eyes were locked on the recipient address of the emails. It was a defunct, obscure email domain, one she vaguely recognized but couldn't immediately place. Her finger hovered over a subfolder titled Photographs. The silence in the room suddenly ringing in her ears like a siren. She was standing on the precipice of a grave, realizing the man she married was not just a liar, but a predator who had buried secrets far older and far closer to home than she could have ever imagined. The click of the mouse echoed in the expansive silence of the penthouse like the sharp, dry crack of a sniper's rifle. Abigail held her breath as the photographs folder unpacked its contents. The high-resolution monitor flooded the dark room with a harsh bluish glare. Dozens of thumbnail images populated the screen, rendering row after row of stolen moments. She did not need to open them fully to understand. The visual data processed in her brain with the slow, agonizing clarity of a nightmare from which she could not wake. There was a candid shot of a woman lying in a tangle of white hotel sheets, her face turned away from the lens, laughing at something out of frame. The photographer's hand was visible in the foreground, adjusting the duvet. Wrapped around the man's wrist was a vintage Patek Philippe, a wedding gift Abigail had bought for Mark in Geneva. But it was the woman's neck that anchored Abigail to the floor. Resting against the woman's collarbone was a distinct teardrop emerald pendant. It was a custom antique piece, a family heirloom. Abigail's eyes darted back to the defunct email address in the registry e.crawford_art@domain.com. Eleanor Crawford. The air evacuated Abigail's lungs. The room began to spin, a quiet, rushing static filling her ears. Eleanor was her mother, her brilliant, complicated mother who had died of aggressive ovarian cancer exactly 3 years ago. She clicked on another image. It was time-stamped December 2019. Mark and Eleanor, sitting in the corner booth of an obscure bistro in Alexandria, their hands intertwined over a glass of Bordeaux. The intimacy in their posture was sickeningly natural. It was a prolonged, deeply rooted affair, overlapping entirely with the years Abigail spent working 80-hour weeks to build the financial foundation that Mark now claimed as his own. A wave of violent nausea hit her. She remembered the funeral. She remembered standing in the freezing rain at Oak Hill Cemetery, her entire body shaking with grief, while Mark held her tightly against his chest. He had stroked her hair. He had delivered a eulogy about Eleanor's vibrant spirit. He was sleeping with her. He had been sleeping with her mother while smiling at Abigail across the Thanksgiving table. Behind her, Vikram remained perfectly still. He had seen the emerald pendant. He had read the name on the file path. The notorious corporate predator, a man who built his fortune on the ruins of bankrupt companies, took a slow step backward, affording her the dark, silent space this level of horror demanded. For the first time, his cynical armor dropped, replaced by a grim, unspoken reverence for the magnitude of the devastation playing out on the screen. Abigail, Vikram murmured, his voice stripped of its usual sharp edge. He moved to the wet bar, poured a single neat measure of Lagavulin, and placed the heavy crystal glass on the desk near her trembling hand. She didn't reach for the glass. She simply stared at the image of her husband and her mother. If Mark's affair with Emily had been a knife to the back, this was a meticulously planned demolition of her entire psychological foundation. Every memory she had of the last decade was a rotting lie. The profound grief threatened to pull her under, to shatter her mind into a million irreparable pieces right there on the glass desk. But as the seconds bled into minutes, the shaking in her hands slowly ceased. The hot, suffocating tears that had burned the corners of her eyes evaporated before they could fall. The woman who had mourned her mother, the wife who had loved her husband, they both died in the blue light of that monitor. What rose from their ashes was an absolute chilling zero. Abigail slowly pushed her chair back and stood up. She turned to Vikram, her face a mask of terrifying porcelain calm. Her eyes, reflecting the glow of the screen, were completely dead. "The board meeting is on Thursday," Abigail said, her voice dropping to a smooth, flat register that belonged to a stranger. "I don't just want his shares, Vikram. I want his life dismantled, piece by piece, in front of everyone." The panoramic windows of the Urban Nails executive boardroom offered a sweeping view of the Washington Monument, bathed in the sharp, unforgiving light of a Thursday morning. Inside, the air was conditioned to a crisp 68 degrees, smelling of expensive leather and freshly brewed Sumatra coffee. Mark Stevens stood at the head of the long mahogany table, projecting a flawlessly polished slide deck detailing the West Coast expansion. 2 seats down, Emily Johnson typed diligently on her tablet, wearing a subtle, proprietary smile. "And by streamlining our executive overhead," Mark was saying, his voice a masterclass in reassuring baritone, "we project a 15% margin increase by Q3. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open. The click of the latch was loud enough to halt Mark mid-sentence. Abigail walked in. She wore a tailored, stark white blazer that looked less like business attire and more like armor. Her heels struck the hardwood floor with a slow, deliberate rhythm that commanded the immediate silence of the 12 board members present. Flanking her was Vikram Patel, his dark suit absorbing the light, his expression radiating a quiet, lethal amusement. Behind them trailed 2 senior partners from DC's most ruthless corporate litigation firm. Mark's perfectly constructed smile faltered, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his eyes before he masked it with patronizing authority. "Abigail, you know you aren't authorized to be here. This is a closed shareholder meeting. Security has already been informed of the change in ownership," Abigail interrupted. Her voice did not rise in volume. It simply cut through the room like a scalpel. She didn't look at Emily. She didn't look at the board. She kept her dead, unblinking gaze fixed entirely on the man who had hollowed out her life. Vikram stepped forward, bypassing the bewildered executives, and dropped a thick, leather-bound dossier onto the center of the table. The heavy thud made the CFO flinch. "As of 9 o'clock this morning," Vikram announced, his tone conversational but dripping with threat, "Patel Holdings has acquired the entirety of Urban Nails' outstanding mezzanine debt. Furthermore, due to an emergency filing with the SEC regarding undisclosed, unauthorized offshore entities, the proxy votes previously held by Mr. Stevens have been legally invalidated." A murmur of confusion and alarm rippled down the table. "What is this?" Mark demanded, the color draining from his face as he looked from Vikram to the board. "This is a stunt. I am the CEO." "You are a liability," Abigail stated softly, stepping up to the edge of the table. She slid a single sheet of paper toward the lead board director. "Page 4, the Delaware LLC. 3 years of siphoned marketing capital funneled into a private account to cover your disastrous personal leveraging. It's corporate fraud, Mark. The SEC is currently reviewing the forensic data." The boardroom descended into a stunned, breathless silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector fan. Emily Johnson had stopped typing, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously toward the exits. She was realizing in real time that her golden ticket had just expired. Through a restructuring of the debt, Abigail continued, her voice devoid of any triumph or joy. "I now hold 55% of the voting shares. The board is being dissolved and reconstituted as we speak. Mark gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. The charming facade had entirely collapsed, leaving behind a pathetic, cornered man. Abby, please, let's take this to my office. We can talk about this. Abby, the nickname he had whispered in her ear, the name he had typed to her mother. Abigail felt the familiar freezing void expand in her chest. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw nothing but a stranger wearing a suit paid for with stolen money. There was no anger left, no grief, just a task that needed to be completed. Your office is currently being packed into boxes by my legal team, Abigail said, turning her back on him to face the remaining executives. Mark Stevens is terminated from Urban Nails, effective immediately. Gentlemen, we have a company to salvage. She did not look back as the security guards quietly entered the room to escort him out. The empire was hers again, but as she took her seat at the head of the table, the leather felt cold, and the victory tasted only of ash. The executive suite of Urban Nails was deafeningly quiet. It was past 9 on a Friday night, the rest of the floor completely abandoned. Abigail stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling grid of Washington, D.C., where the headlights of evening traffic bled into a continuous glowing river. She held a tumbler of sparkling water, the condensation dampening her fingertips. She was the CEO again. The hostile takeover was a textbook success. Mark was facing a potential SEC indictment, and Emily Johnson had vanished from the Capitol entirely. It was everything she had fought for. Yet as she stared at her reflection in the darkened glass, she felt entirely hollow. The throne was hers, but she was ruling over a graveyard. The soft click of the heavy oak door opening didn't startle her. Only one person had bypassing clearance to this floor after hours. Vikram Patel walked in, the sharp lines of his bespoke suit softened by the dim amber lighting of the room. He didn't carry any folders, tablets, or the usual armor of their corporate war. He moved with a quiet, unhurried grace, stopping a few feet away from where she stood. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch from the crystal decanter on her mahogany credenza, the sound of glass against glass breaking the heavy silence. The board ratified the new equity structure an hour ago. Vikram said, his voice low, lacking its usual cynical edge. You own it all, Abigail. Every brick, every patent. Thank you, Vikram, she replied, not turning away from the window. Your capital made it possible. It wasn't just my capital. He took a step closer. The scent of his cologne, sandalwood, and something distinctly sharp drifted into her space. It was your nerve. I've watched men with twice your resources crumble under half the pressure. Abigail finally turned to face him. The ambient light from the city below cast half of his face in shadow, highlighting the intensity of his dark eyes. Over the past chaotic weeks, the boundaries of their transactional alliance had imperceptibly shifted. They had spent countless nights in the trenches of encrypted servers and legal briefs, communicating in a shorthand born of mutual ruthlessness. There was an undeniable magnetic pull between them, two predators who recognized the same cold intelligence in each other. Vikram reached out his hand, pausing in the space between them. For a fleeting second, Abigail imagined leaning into that touch. She imagined the warmth, the possibility of exhaling, of letting someone else carry the crushing weight of her survival. But then, like a physical blow, the image flashed behind her eyes, Mark's hand resting on the white hotel sheets, her mother's emerald pendant catching the light, the timestamps of their hidden lives overlapping perfectly with her own memories of family dinners and anniversaries. The invisible wall slammed down cold and impenetrable. Abigail took a subtle, almost imperceptible half-step back. The movement was slight, but to a man as observant as Vikram, it was deafening. He let his hand drop slowly to his side, his expression shifting from quiet vulnerability to a solemn, profound understanding. You won the war, Abigail, Vikram murmured, his gaze locking onto hers with a tragic clarity. But you're still fighting the ghosts. The ghosts don't lie to me, she whispered, her voice tightening. She looked down at her own hands, realizing how rigidly she was gripping her glass. Every person I have ever loved, every foundation I ever trusted, was a meticulously crafted deception. I don't know how to turn this off, Vikram. I don't think I ever will. Vikram didn't offer hollow reassurances. He didn't tell her that time would heal her, or that he was different. He simply nodded, respecting the absolute freezing boundaries of her trauma. He finished his scotch, set the glass carefully on the desk, and buttoned his jacket. If you ever find your way out of the ice, Abigail, he said softly, turning toward the door, you know where to find me. Until then, congratulations on your empire. When the door clicked shut behind him, the silence rushed back in heavier than before. Abigail turned back to the window alone at the very top of the world, surrounded by the ruins of her heart. The late November rain washed over the large pane windows of the DuPont Circle Cafe, blurring the headlights of passing town cars into streaks of pale gold. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued, smelling of roasted espresso beans and damp wool. Abigail sat in a corner booth upholstered in dark green leather. She wore a simple charcoal turtleneck, her posture relaxed but impeccably straight. She had agreed to this meeting not out of lingering affection, nor out of pity, but for the finality of it. The bell above the door chimed. Mark stepped inside, bringing the biting chill of the street with him. Abigail watched him navigate the narrow aisle, noting the brutal toll the past month had taken. The charismatic, untouchable CEO of the Rosewood Country Club was gone. The bespoke suit he wore hung slightly loose on his frame, his collar slightly wrinkled, his eyes ringed with the bruised exhaustion of a man facing federal prosecution. His assets were frozen. His reputation in Washington was thoroughly incinerated, and Emily Johnson had long since abandoned him for a senior partner at a rival firm. He slid into the booth opposite her, refusing to meet her eyes right away. He looked at her untouched cup of black tea, his hands trembling slightly as he clasped them on the marble tabletop. "Thank you for coming, Abby," he started, his voice a hoarse, hollow echo of its former baritone. Abigail did not correct his use of the nickname. She merely looked at him, feeling a strange, hollow sensation in her chest. For weeks, she had anticipated this moment, the final confrontation, the satisfying climax of her vengeance. But sitting across from him now, she felt absolutely nothing. The hatred and the paralyzing grief had burned themselves out, leaving behind a sterile Arctic expanse. "The SEC is moving to indict on Tuesday." Mark continued, a desperate, frantic edge creeping into his tone. He finally looked up, his eyes pleading. "My legal team is demanding a retainer I can't liquidate. They've frozen the offshore accounts. They've frozen everything. Abigail, I'm going to lose the townhouse. I'm going to prison." He paused, clearly waiting for a reaction for the empathetic wife he had manipulated for a decade to surface. When she offered only a terrifying, unblinking silence, he leaned forward, his voice cracking. "I know what I did with the company was unforgivable. I got lost in the expansion, the pressure of the board. And Emily was a mistake, a stupid, meaningless distraction. But we built a life together, Abby. 10 years. You can't just let them destroy me. A character reference alone against my remaining frozen equity, anything. Please." Abigail looked at his hands resting on the table. She saw the vintage Patek Philippe watch strapped to his left wrist. The same watch that had been visible in the background of a photograph resting against white hotel sheets inches away from her mother's emerald pendant. He didn't know. He truly believed her wrath was simply about the company and a young marketing director. He was completely oblivious to the fact that she had unearthed the darkest, most grotesque rot at the foundation of their entire existence. And looking at his pathetic, desperate face, she realized he wasn't worth the breath it would take to scream it at him. He was a small, hollow man, incapable of understanding the magnitude of the destruction he had caused. "You destroyed yourself, Mark," Abigail said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the final, undeniable weight of a gavel striking wood. "I am merely the one who stopped paying for it." She slowly raised her left hand. The 3-carat diamond engagement ring and the platinum wedding band felt incredibly heavy, a physical manifestation of a decade built on lies and graves. With methodical, unhurried grace, she slid the rings over her knuckle. Mark watched, his breath hitching as the platinum clinked softly against the cold marble table. "Abigail, please, do not ever contact me again," she said, cutting him off with a calmness that made him physically recoil. She stood up, picking up her coat. She didn't wait for his tears or his final desperate excuses. She walked toward the door, leaving the rings glittering under the cafe's dim pendant lights, leaving him alone with the ashes of his own making. Stepping out onto the rain-slickened pavement of Washington, D.C., the freezing night air hit her lungs like a shock of pure electricity. The city stretched out before her, a labyrinth of power, secrets, and shadows. She pulled her collar up against the wind. Her mother was gone. Her marriage was a ghost story. Her heart was permanently encased in ice. But as she merged into the flow of the city's relentless rhythm, Abigail Reed took her first breath as a completely free woman, ready to rule her empire alone.